Thank you for all for joining today. My name's Kip Solomon, and myself and Tony Von Dam are handling the Distinguished Lecture Series this year. Just a few comments. The meet and greet that we've normally done before lectures, we're going to try to do that after the lectures now, and that will pertain to both the live and virtual lectures. So we'll hopefully some of you will have some time to stick around after the lecture today, and chat a little bit. We have a nice lineup for this year. About 50% of the lectures will be live and about 50% will be virtual. As of today, it's anybody's guess as to what COVID's going to do to us. So some of the live, are subject to change, of course. But what's really important to note is that there isn't really any kind of pattern to the live. I mean, we tried to kind of spread them out, but it was all, personal preferences and schedules and that. So you're going to just have to go to the department website and the flyer each week to find out whether it's live or virtual. And we'll, try to keep sending out lots of announcements about that. The lectures this year are going to also include, this is something, I guess not entirely new, but slightly. We have a number of faculty members that are being reviewed this year. We have a formal review for tenure for one faculty member, Kathleen Ritterbusch. And then we have a number of faculty members that are undergoing post-tenure reviews. And we thought it might be a nice tradition to start having those faculty members that are being reviewed give us a lecture. So that will be happening, the first of which will be in 2 weeks from now, which will be Gabe Bowen. Next week's lecture will be given by Katrina Twing. She's going to talk to us about microbial ecology of subsurface serpentinite rocks, and that will be live. Katrina's at Weber State University and actually lives here in Salt Lake, and so we hope that you'll all plan on joining that. There are a few of you students that are signed up for the class that's associated with the Distinguished Lecture Series. Full disclosure, I actually didn't realize until about an hour ago that or maybe I did and forgot, but either way, that I was in charge of that. Suffice it to say that I'll either be setting up a Canvas page or send to you all an email about the requirements. They're pretty simple for getting credit for the lecture series. And then finally, of course, you all know to please try to mute yourselves during the lecture, and after the lecture, we'll use the raise hand function. If you are down in the auditorium, you can raise your hand, and Alan Rigby is there, and I think Gordon also, to sort of raise virtually your hand. You'll have to kind of come up to the podium to speak into the microphone on the computer if you have questions. So with that, I'm going to turn the time over to Mike Thorne, who's going to introduce our distinguished lecturer today.
Okay. Well, I'd like to welcome everyone back to the fall semester and a new distinguished lecture series. So, as Kip just mentioned, some of our lectures this semester are going to be in person and some are going to be virtual. I'm really excited for this hybrid approach, as having some of these virtual lectures allow us to invite some really great scientists from around the world that we wouldn't normally be able to support in our lecture series. And this week is one of the first of those in which we're very pleased to welcome Megan Miller from Australian National University to give our talk. So just to introduce Megan a little bit, she's been all over the place. She started off, she did a bachelor's at Whittier College, and then she did an MS at Columbia University, and then a master's of engineering from Cornell University before moving on to do her PhD at Australian National University. After which she returned to the US to do a postdoc at Rice. Then she spent a year at the University of Calgary, and then spent several years in a professorship at USC, before which she just moved back to Australian National University in a professorship starting in 2017. Well, it's really, really great to have her here, to be able to have her to speak to us today. Her research has had a strong emphasis in seismology of plate boundaries, and especially on subduction zones, but it's spanned the whole range of the mantle, and most recently has even involved a series of studies on D double prime discontinuity. So I'd like to welcome Megan, and today she's going to talk to us about inherited lithospheric structures, how they control arc continental collisional heterogeneity. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the nice introduction. It's my pleasure to be here. See if I can give you the right screen. Okay. All right, so as Mike mentioned, I'm going to talk about plate boundary structure, which is much of my research has focused on. In particular, today I'm going to talk about a large project that started about 10 years ago when Torsten Becker, Josh West, and I were all at USC. And this project couldn't have happened without the many, many students and postdocs and collaborators around the world. And so I'll get started. Of course, there we go. Okay, so here's an image of the Earth with earthquakes plotted in green. But today I'd like to, this is a tradition that we do in Australia, and I think it's catching on in the US as well as to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land of which I usually work. And these are the Ngambri and Ngunnawal people around Canberra. And so Canberra is shown here. There's actually a little bit of snow there. So it does snow in the hills around Canberra, and there is some skiing. You can call it skiing. I don't, last time I went skiing was actually in Utah, and I haven't gone since because I'd prefer to ski in Utah than around Canberra. But today I'm actually working from the south coast to New South Wales, which is where the Yuin people are the traditional custodians. And so I'd like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land, those from the past, present, and those emerging. We recognize the connection that they have with the land, the sea, and waterways for tens of thousands of years. And so today I'm going to talk about this part of the world to the north of where I am in Australia. And so here is the region to the north of Indonesia, the Indonesian archipelago, where the Indo-Australian plate is rapidly subducting and colliding with the Eurasian plate to the north. And this long archipelago and arc extends more than 7,000 kilometers, actually from beyond the map here, from the Sumatra Andaman arc all the way around to the Java arc, and then curves around to the Banda arc here. And so as you can probably notice from the bathymetry that's shown here, that the oceanic lithosphere of the Indo-Australian plate has this very beautiful, very well-defined trench that as you move farther to the east, then the Australian continent is quite clear, and this is where this is colliding with the Banda arc here. And so there are two lines of arcs, the inner arc, which is the active arc shown with the volcanoes, active volcanoes shown in red here, and then the outer arc, which are these two, can be made of these two islands. Sorry, still not working. Two prominent islands, which is the island of Sumba, located here, and Timor. And so neither one of these are volcanic islands, but are actually uplifted four arc islands and make the outer arc here. And some other bathymetry and some features that I wanted to point out is the Scott Plateau, which is shown here, as well as the Xmap Plateau and the Wallaby Plateau. And so this dotted line that I've drawn on the map is the inferred boundary between the oceanic lithosphere and continental lithosphere. And this will become important throughout the talk. But to understand a little bit more about how this tectonic region has evolved, I'm going to show you a tectonic reconstruction from Spachman and Hall. And so the next slide will be an animation showing how this has evolved through the past 30 million years. But just to put everything into place, you can see that these green shaded areas are old oceanic crust. So this is crust that's more than 120 million years old. This is younger oceanic crust shown in blue. Arc material is in kind of this neon green located here. And then Eurasian crust, which is continental Eurasian crust, are shown in yellow. And then this boundary, which is very similar to that dotted line that I showed in the previous bathymetry map, is the boundary between oceanic lithosphere and continental lithosphere. And all of the red part are the Australian continental lithosphere, and the age of these rocks are generally Jurassic in age. And here you can see the Scott Plateau and the Xmap Plateau, which I pointed out before, and then the islands of Sumba. So here's this non-volcanic island in the outer arc, and also the island of Timor, which is also non-volcanic in origin. So the next slide I'm going to show is going to be animation, which will repeat on a loop to show you how this has evolved through the last 30 million years. And up in the upper left-hand corner will be the age of that part of reconstruction in millions of years. So as we go forward in time, you can see that the Indo-Australian plate is moving northwards towards the Eurasian plate. And this old oceanic crust is being consumed along the arc. And then the subduction zone evolves. And so you can see that there's this large embayment here, which makes up Papua New Guinea in the northern part of Australia. And you see that there's very rapid rollback into this region, forming this highly arcuate shape of the Banda Arc. And the other thing to note is this jagged edge of the oceanic continental boundary. And you see at about 4 million years, that's when that's when Australia collides and Timor starts to be uplifted above sea level and evolving into similar to what it is today. But I just want you to note this jagged edge morphology of the oceanic continental boundary, both in the past, but also in the present day bathymetry. Okay, so that's how this very complex collisional zone has developed over the last 30 million years. Some other things that are a result of this complex collision of the Australian continent is this change in the volcanics. Okay, so here I'm plotting the active volcanoes in red. Here is this oceanic continental boundary that you can see across, and then this is the Scott Plateau that you can see in the bathymetry, and then the Australian continental margin. Here I've plotted the volcanoes that have a lithologic change in crustal input. So I'll get to the details about this later in the talk, but this is kind of a very simplified view of where the geochemistry of the volcanoes changes from having a different crustal input. So not just oceanic crust that's been subducted and having kind of normal arc chemistry, but where there are some continental crustal materials that have been incorporated into the subduction zone. And then you can see this in the volcanics here. And then as we move farther to the east, you notice that there are no active volcanoes anymore. And so this is one of the indicators that helped with the timing of when the collision of the continental lithosphere collided along here, and there was no longer oceanic lithosphere being subducted, and so no longer having any arc volcanoes. And so the timing for that is about 4 to 6 million years ago. Okay, so in this region, very complex, interesting region, we deployed 30 broadband seismometers for about 4.5 years in 2014 through to 2019. And so this is a distribution of those broadband seismometers that were deployed across the region. And what we wanted to do is try to understand more about how an continent collision evolves through time. And so this is a unique opportunity to try to see how it evolves temporally, because to the west, we have normal oceanic subduction going on. Here, there's a transition, and then there's continent collision over here, a no longer active arc. And so if we look at the variation along strike, we should be able to understand a little bit about how this evolves through time. And so one of the fundamental hypotheses that we were testing in this project was to see if we can image a slab tear. And so this idea of how a slab tears is due to a continental collision. So this is a cartoon from Wortel and Spachman in 2000, where they proposed that if you have normal oceanic lithosphere subducting, so this is a subducted slab here, the overriding plate at this point. So you have regular oceanic lithosphere being subducted, but at the trailing edge, you have continental lithosphere. So this would be analogous to Australia, Australian continental lithosphere, and then regular oceanic lithosphere that has previously been subducted. The oceanic lithosphere is negatively buoyant. It wants to subduct and go down into the mantle, but the continental lithosphere is thicker, more buoyant, positively buoyant, and doesn't want to subduct. So then you could tear away this, the oceanic portion of the lithosphere from the continental part and tear it away. And this had been proposed to be happening in the Banda Arc in Eastern Indonesia by Eli and Sandiford in 2010. And they inferred that this tear was actually happening by looking at seismic catalogs. And so they saw that they inferred that there was a tear propagating eastward beneath the Banda Arc, and it was currently at about 150 kilometers east of Timor, near the island of Wetar. And I'm sorry, I forgot to point out the island of Wetar in the previous maps. Hopefully it was labeled, hopefully you caught it. And so we wanted to try to see if we could actually image a slab tear. So they inferred it from seismicity, but can we use seismic imaging to do this? But perhaps a better question that we should have asked is, can we image a change in slab composition? So can we image where the oceanic lithosphere, where there's a difference between the oceanic lithosphere being subducted and continental lithosphere? So throughout this talk, I'll try to answer both of these questions. Okay, so we can start by looking at earthquake catalogs. So this is the catalog of relocated earthquakes that Eli and Sandiford used to infer where this Wetar seismic gap was. Here's the island of Wetar. So this relocated catalog focused just on Benioff zone seismicity. So the earthquakes plotted here are only from 50 kilometers depth and greater, color-coded by depth, as you see. And so there's a lack of deeper intermediate depth earthquakes in this region here. And so this is where they inferred the Wetar seismic gap, which is very, very prominent here. And Doss had noted it, and then Eli and Sandiford used this and also looked at focal mechanisms to infer where this slab tear may be. But of course, this data only went up until actually 1999. So if we look at the USGS earthquake catalog, of course, these are not relocated, but it can still give us an additional 21 years worth of data. And still appears that there may be a gap in seismicity. However, note that I'm also plotting crustal events here. So those are from surface events down to greater than 500 up until last week. So I just grabbed the catalogs from the 70s up until now. It still looks like there could be a gap in seismicity. So maybe there really is a tear near this island of Wetar. So one of the things that we're working on now is try to see if we can, if this is due to not being able to record earthquakes there, or if there really truly is a lack of seismicity in the area. And so we've been working on a preliminary new earthquake catalog. So from the 4.5 years that we have data from those 30 broadband stations, this is our new catalog. We have more than 15,000 earthquakes that have happened during that time period. And it looks like maybe there still is a gap in seismicity. But it's not quite as clear as it was previously. And this may be due to the fact that there are now seismometers in the region. So there hadn't been any seismometers other than these 3, which you can see in blue located here, that are publicly available at the time. But a better way to probably try to image this and look at the catalog is in 3D. And so this is the DOS catalog that I showed before. And so this is this Wetar seismic gap that they imaged. This is a view to the north. Here's the island of Timor. Here's Sumba, and then the volcanic arc and the Sulawesi to the north. So here is this gap in seismicity that was identified previously. If we plot part of our new catalog, it looks like that area is actually collapsing. So it's not quite as dramatic as it was before. So it's not quite clear that this would be the best way to try to see if there is a slab tear or not. But this is a work that's still ongoing. Of course, we're not just recording local earthquakes from this deployment, but we're looking at teleseismic earthquakes. And this is probably very familiar to many of the people in the audience, but just a quick refresher that we're looking at. We also look at teleseismic earthquakes. So this is a beautiful animation by Iris. It's one of my favorite ones, even though it's already 11 years old. This is a Haiti earthquake that occurred in 2010, not the one that happened just recently. That was recorded at the U.S. array stations, which were deployed in the middle of the U.S. at the time. And so this animation is going to show a seismogram that was in Texas, which is located here, and also the wavefronts coming across. So the green line indicates the P wave, the compressional wave that comes first. And then the red one will be the S waves shown here, and then the yellow will be the surface waves. And so we can use all of this different types of seismic waves and the wave train to do different types of seismic imaging. So we don't just use the local earthquakes, but we can use earthquakes such as these to do imaging of the subsurface and the mantle structure. And here's just an example of one such earthquake and data that recorded in Timor-Leste. So this is a Kaikoura earthquake that happened in New Zealand in 2016 that was recorded in Timor-Leste at one seismometer, which is located here, and these 3 component seismometers. So again, here's the P wave arrival, the S, and then the surface waves. And so we can use these types of data to do different types of imaging. For example, teleseismic body wave tomography, which may be the most familiar to most people, where you look at delay times to image subsurface structure. So for example, here's a volcano, and there's these red blobs indicate slower velocity material relative to faster areas, which are generally shown with cooler colors or blues. So throughout the talk, I'm gonna show you some body wave tomography. I'll start with that, which tells us more about the deeper upper mantle structure, teleseismic surface wave tomography using Rayleigh waves, and then also ambient noise tomography, which doesn't use teleseismic earthquakes, but actually uses the noise recorded at 2 different stations. And you can look at the cross correlation between the 2 to then do analyses to look at the velocity structure generally of the crust. And so those are the 3 different types of seismic imaging techniques that I'm going to talk about today. Of course, there's many others that can also be used that we are doing as a work in progress. Okay, so some of the other first results is we'll start with the teleseismic P wave tomography. So I'm not going to talk about the methods at all, just show you the results of this work. So the teleseismic P wave tomography shown here at 100 kilometers depth. These blues indicate faster velocity material, which are indicative of subducted slab material. So at 100 kilometers depth across the region, here's the island of Timor, Sumba, and then the inner arc here. Very clearly fast velocity material that extends across the entire region at 100 kilometers depth. So if there was a tear, you would see a lack of fast velocity material, for example. So if we, and then the next thing we're going to show is the volcanoes. So these are the active volcanoes, and these are the ones that are indicating this change in lithology input, but across this entire region and also farther to the east towards the island of Wetar, there seems to be fast velocity material at this depth that's continuous. If we look at a slice of the model slightly deeper at 210 kilometers depth, again, there seems to be continuously fast velocity material beneath the inner arc. And again, the volcanoes showing this. But one thing that starts to pop out of something of interest is that the fast velocity material here, the active arc, seems to extend a little bit farther to the north. And so you can infer that the dip is not as steep as it is beneath this portion, but it's still this continuous fast velocity material. If we go again a little bit deeper at 300 kilometers depth, it still is continuous across the region. We start to lose resolution as we go farther to the east because we don't have seismometers there, but we still have this continuous fast velocity, which is indicative that there is not a slab tear. And if we plot the volcanoes again, we see that seems to be a change in shape of the subducted slab near where this change in lithologic change in the input of the volcanoes is located. And so from these results, Cooper Harris, who was a student of mine at USC, had proposed that what he was seeing in the P-wave tomography was something schematically like this. Okay, so this is a cartoon. So north is in this direction here. This is the incoming Australian continental lithosphere with the coastlines in green, and then the islands located here, and there's Sumba and Timor. He proposed that there is a difference in dip along strike, so less steeply dipping on the western side of the study region, more steeply dipping to the north of Timor, and he attributed this to this incoming Scott Plateau. And so there's a change from regular oceanic lithosphere to continental lithosphere going into the subduction zone, and this would change the angle of dip of the subducting material, and then also where the Scott Plateau is starting to come in beneath Sumba. Okay, so this is by looking at both the change in lithology and also the shape of the subducting slab, he thought that you could infer where this boundary between the continental lithosphere and oceanic lithosphere was, both at depth and at the surface. But he thought that and I agree that it looks like the slab is continuous. There was no indication of a slab tear, so there's no lack of fast velocity material along the length of the study region. And he did some resolution tests, which I can show if anybody's interested later, showing that we would be able to actually infer if there was a slab tear. Okay, so the slab tear looks to be less conclusive as we thought. We're not able to image a slab tear from the P-wave tomography, but can we detect if there is flow? So here, there's this, had been proposed that there would be inflow of a asthenosphere into this torn part of the subducted slab. So we can do this by looking at shear wave splitting. So shear wave splitting uses core phases. So these are earthquakes, teleseismic earthquakes, again, that go through the core and then come back out to the other side of the Earth. And shear waves can travel through an anisotropic medium. So we can, for simplification, we can think of this as through the asthenosphere, and this is the asthenosphere is flowing. And and we can measure this or infer this by looking at shear waves. And so when shear waves go through this anisotropic medium, they split into two different waves. So this shows the blue and red. We can measure the delay time between these two different shear waves, and we can also infer the fast axis of which this anisotropy is indicated. And then that can tell us infer the direction of flow. And we assume that the origin of this observed seismic anisotropy is from lattice preferred orientation of olivine formed during mantle flow. Okay, so Cooper Harris also did this. This is a work that's under revision at the moment. So these are the average teleseismic shear wave splitting results across the region. So at those 30 stations, it's kind of an interesting pattern. So most of the shear wave splits, so the delay times are shown by the length of these red sticks. And the orientation of the flow pattern inferred fast axes is indicated by their azimuth. So most of these are roughly origin parallel, so east-west more or less, except for this group of these on the island of Flores, where they turn almost 90 degrees and become north-south oriented ones. And what's interesting with those, if we plot these on top of the P-wave tomography results, they also occur where this kind of sharp change in the morphology of the subducted slab and the slab dip are oriented. And so although the slab seems to be continuous here, there is this sharp change in orientation. And so Cooper has suggested that most of this can be attributed to flow around the corner here, but not flow through the slab, because there's no indication that there's actually a tear. And so he thinks that this is due to the change from oceanic subducted lithosphere to continental subducted lithosphere and the change in shape of the slab itself, not of inflow into a tear. And also just to note again that this previously inferred tear from the Wetar seismic gap would be over here, and there's no indication or dramatic change in orientation of the shear wave splits where there had previously thought to have been a slab tear. Okay, so curious results. So maybe this question before, rather than trying to look at a slab tear, but actually changing in a composition within the lithosphere is a better question to ask. So far we've been looking at mantle depth, so looking at the tear or possible tear and possible deep subduction of the oceanic lithosphere. But what if we try to look at a change of composition within the lithosphere itself, so going up to shallower depths? And just to remind you from the reconstruction that I showed at the beginning of the talk, this jagged edge morphology. Okay, so at 4 million years ago, when the collision of Australia first hit the arc and the volcanism turned off in the island arc, this is when we had this jagged edge here. And so this is also this is the change of where that Cooper had found in his P-wave tomography, and also the shear wave splitting. So what if we try to image what's going on in the lithosphere? So this jagged edge, which is very cartoonish in their reconstruction, of course has been proposed from evidence from geology. So this jagged edge of the Australian continental margin came from the Jurassic. So those red colors in the reconstruction were showing the Jurassic age of the rocks. This jagged edge is inferred from the rifting of East Gondwana in the Jurassic. So the picture on the left shows what the structure or the tectonic configuration was in the Jurassic. And so if you can see here, we have India, Antarctica, and Australia. And this would be the edge of Western Australia here. And this is the rifting of East Gondwana. So as the ocean basin opened, we had this jagged edge that had developed. And so there's a set of basins and also plateaus that happened during this time. And so here is the Carnarvon Basin, Perth, which is in Western Australia, farther to the south, the Canning Basin and Bonaparte Basin, and then these salients that are coming here. And so if we look on this side, this is the Carnarvon Basin currently. The Canning Basin is onshore northwest Australia, and the Bonaparte Basin is here. And so these basins and these salients and embayments are the formation of this jagged structure that initiated in the Jurassic when East Gondwana rifted apart. Okay, so if we look at this configuration currently offshore, what can we, how do we try to look at the lithospheric structure currently in the Banda Arc? So we can do this by looking at teleseismic Rayleigh wave tomography. These are preliminary results, and also ambient noise tomography. So looking at the Rayleigh waves shown here, or looking at cross correlations of 4 years worth of data. And so the teleseismic results, which I'm going to show first, are work in progress. My student Ping Chang is working on these now. And so here are 4 depth slices through her model. And so here's the island of Sumba and Timor. And just to note that although the color scheme that we're using is the same as the P-wave tomography, now we're not looking at delay times, we're looking at absolute velocities, shear wave velocities here, just as a reference. So she used about 700 events. She's currently updating for the next 2 years worth of data. But again, looking at her results, there's some interesting structure. So we have, again, this change across at about 123 degrees east. And that's just where this change in lithologic input for the crustal contamination of the volcanics also occurs here. So that's basically the same place as where the shear wave splitting had a change in orientation. It's also the place where there was a change in dip of the subducting slab at deeper depths, so at about 210 kilometers that Cooper showed in his P-wave results, and then also here. So there's very striking boundary, which we infer to be the change from oceanic to continental, at depth. Okay, so this is kind of curious that this pattern continues, but it's also from deep also to shallower lithospheric, the uppermost mantle and lithospheric scale depths. Okay, so these are just preliminary results that I wanted to show them. But if we go even shallower and try to look at the crustal structure, we can again look at it with a different technique, but just to remind you to look at this boundary that we see here. But now we can look at even more closely what these boundaries are. And so I'm going to show you results from the Xmap Plateau located here. So here you see the Xmap Plateau. And so these previously published results looked at what the structure of these plateaus are. So if we look at this cross section, which is along X prime, they inferred that along that strike, you can image what is regular oceanic crust. This is a volcanic margin crust from the rifting of Gondwana. And then this Gondwana megasequence, which are basin sediments that are more than 10 kilometers thick, and then lower crust, and then mantle, and there may be these lower crustal boundaries. So this is what the structure of the Xmap Plateau looks like. And so that's located here. So if we keep this in mind and then look at the ambient noise tomography, which is looking at crustal scale imaging of the region in the Banda Arc, here are the ambient noise results. So again, these are shear wave velocity, absolute velocities, but through the crust. So from depths from 15 kilometers down to 40 kilometers. And here's the island of Sumba and Timor. And so the browns or warm colors indicate lower velocity features. And so across Timor, it looks like there's a lot of slow material. We infer these to be the Gondwana megasequence that, and they're more than 10 kilometers thick prior to coming into the collisional zone. And then from geologic mapping, there's been duplexing of these Gondwana megasequences, so very, very thick sedimentary packages. So these seem to extend all the way down to at least 25 kilometers thick. And then the faster high velocity features are inferred to be the oceanic plateau, which has been subducted. So the Scott Plateau beneath the island of Sumba here. But if we look at slightly deeper depths, it starts to be a little bit more complex. So we don't just have continuous slow velocities across Timor and towards Sumba, but we get these higher velocity patches too. So there seems to be this alternating structure between slow velocities and high velocities in the crust and the lower crust beneath the island of Timor. And so here they have this low, high, low seismic velocities. And so how we're interpreting that is inferring that there's a plateau which has been previously proposed by Kiepenhage to be the Timor Plateau. That's very much like the Xmap Plateau that I showed you before. And so in their tectonic reconstruction that they did about 10 years ago, they had proposed that a plateau that looks like the Xmap Plateau has already been underthrust and subducted beneath Timor. And so they think that it looks like this. Okay, so this would be 10 million years ago and prior. This dotted line is the Scott Plateau. This is the Timor Plateau. And as it comes northward, it then gets subducted underneath Timor. And so this is what it would look like at depth. And that looks very similar to what we're seeing in the velocity structure. So at 40 kilometers depth, here's something that's shaped like this. This would be the Timor Plateau underthrust beneath Timor. And it looks like the Xmap Plateau. And of course, they had used this similar outline of what the Xmap Plateau is to propose what the Timor Plateau shape would be. And so we think we're actually imaging this underthrusted and subducted Timor Plateau beneath the island of Timor. And then this portion, this fast bit here, is the Scott Plateau, which has been subducted beneath Sumba. And if we look at these in cross-section, so along A prime, for example, beneath Timor, here is the structure. We see this very slow material, which is the Gondwana megasequence. And then we see this underthrusted volcanic margin crust, which is much faster. And then if we look along this profile from B to B prime, we see even more of this a very complex structure, which would be the underthrusted Australian margin in this inherited volcanic margin crust beneath that was part of the Scott Plateau. Okay, and if we go back to the this familiar map looking at the active volcanoes with the inferred change of crustal input, this is a very, very simplified version that I made of what the geochemistry actually looks like. If we look at plot this with the lead-lead ratios, it's a little bit more, you see it's a lot more variable and more complex. And so the reds are the ones that have this contamination from crustal input, continental crustal input, and then the blues ones are regular arc chemistry. So for example, over here in the Java arc, they have more of these cooler colors, which are kind of more indicative of normal subduction. But we do have some of these located here, and then interestingly, a variation to the north of Timor. And then these are the ones that are currently extinct in Wetar. So if we look at these in profile along this cross-section. These are, again, some preliminary results by my student Ping Zhang. If we look at her crustal structure from ambient noise, and then the teleseismic surface wave results to get a deeper view. It's quite interesting that these ones that have the bluer colors, that have less of this contamination from continental material, these are the ones where there is faster velocity, faster velocity that extends from closer to the upper crust, and then very fast material in the lower crust and the mantle lithosphere, which would be indicative of the slab here. So we're still working on that in progress, but it's interesting that you can seem to tie the chemistry even in more detail than we did with the P-wave tomography and the shear wave splitting. Okay, so the last piece of the puzzle, which is based upon this cartoon here, is that looking at uplift correlated with the slab tear. Okay, so that was the other piece of the puzzle that I didn't mention previously, but if you rip off or tear away the subducted oceanic lithosphere from below, once that tears away, it can rebound and you'll have the uplift expression in the overriding plate here. And so this is work from Max Dahlquist, who was a PhD student at USC with Josh West. He looked at river terrace uplift modeling. So this is obviously not my area of expertise, but an important piece of the puzzle. So he looked at river profiles where the elevation of the riverbed is plotted as a function of distance along the riverbed. And this contains information about uplift rate. So when a region is uplifted, there's rapid change in the gradient along this profile. And the erosional process causes this gradient to migrate upstream, and then you get this nick point located here. So a river profile can effectively be a tape recording of the uplift rate history. And so you can do modeling of this. And so if erosion is assumed to be dominated by this nick point retreating, a inverse model can be formulated and used to calculate the uplift rate histories. And so this is what he did as part of his PhD. So he looked at river terraces across the region. And so these are the circles shown here are his model results. And this is the uplift rate for the last 100,000 years. Of course, this is very recent in comparison to the 4 million year time frame that we're looking at from the initial collision of Australia, but it can be indicative of recent uplift due to a slab tear, for example. And so that's one of the things that we were proposing. So the dark colors here are the ones where you have faster uplift. Okay, and the lighter colors is where you have the uplift rate is lower. So in Central Timor, for example, we'll just focus on Timor. There seems to be not a lot of uplift, not nearly as much uplift as it does at the ends of the slabs. The end of the islands here are uplifting much faster than the center. But that's quite curious because when you look at the topography is much higher at this point than it is at the ends of the island. But if we plot the inferred location of the Timor Plateau that we got from the ambient noise tomography, as well as the Scott Plateau here, the uplift rates are highest at the ends, but the topography are higher here, just where we have this faster velocity material. And then if we look at the lead isotopes again along the collisional zone, notice that where these extend go towards these warmer colors of the lead isotope ratio, which is where we have more continental material to be input into the subduction zone. So putting this all together, here I'm going to plot these panels roughly oriented parallel to the convergence directions. The convergence direction is coming in this way here. So here's the lead isotope ratio with the outline of the Scott Plateau and the Timor Plateau from the ambient noise tomography. Here's the uplift rates where we have the faster uplift at the either ends of the island, not where the highest topography is. And here is the The ambient noise tomography results at 40 kilometers depth. So now looking at the lowermost crust, uppermost mantle, where we inferred the Timor Plateau here. And then also looking at deeper structures. So again, this is the P-wave tomography model at 100 kilometers depth, where we see this break and change in slab morphology. And so putting all of these different pieces together, we are inferring that the inherited lithospheric structure, so from the incoming plate on the Indo-Australian plate, is having dramatic effects on how the collision zone is actually developing. And so the main observations that we get from this wide range of different techniques is that the change in dip in structure of the slab correlates with this primary change in the volcanics, which is at the boundary between the oceanic subduction and continental subduction. So this main break between the two, the edge of this, and that there's a change in inferred seismic anisotropy observations from the shear wave splitting, but there's no clear slab tear. And then the observed structural heterogeneity that we see from the ambient noise tomography, as well as the teleseismic surface wave tomography, correlates with these very detailed changes that we see in the chemistry. And the modeled uplift rates at the ends are higher or faster at the ends of Timor. It correlates spatially with the structural heterogeneities inferred from the crustal depth of the tomography. And so we are inferring that the results infer from all of these different results that we're imaging a change in the subducted subducted lithospheric composition along strike, which completely corresponds to this jagged edge of the ocean continent boundary that that started way back in the Jurassic when East Gondwana first rifted. And so how the orogenesis and how the arc has developed through time has been due to this inherited structure. And so we're thinking that the initial template of what the lithosphere looks like controls the eventual orogenic structure. And this deserves further attention to understand collisional tectonics globally. So I'd just like to say thank you for the invitation, and thank you. This was work was funded from NSF, from Tectonics Geophysics, and also a career grant, as well as smaller grants from the SEG. And many people contributed to all the field work. It's a huge effort to get these 30 broadband stations out, and I'm happy to take questions. Thank you.
Please join me in some virtual applause. So Megan has graciously offered to take some questions if we have any.
Sure, I have a question. I'll jump in. Justin, I'm curious in that often we see slab tears being invoked. Like I've seen slab tears being invoked in a lot of different places. And I know you've also worked and doing a lot of imaging in a lot of other subduction zones. Is there any place where we actually see convincing evidence for a slab tear existing, or is this?
It's a good question. So I think in Italy is one place where I think it's quite convincing that there is a slab tear, and that's from many of these different pieces of the puzzle that I tried to put together, where the chemistry is very apparent. The shear wave splitting is very apparent, where it looks like you can see mantle flow coming through this hole. There's a very prominent gap in the high velocity materials as well. And so it's kind of has all of those pieces, which, you know, any one of them could be used to suggest that there's a slab tear, but it's kind of got all of them. So that's the one that I think is the most convincing. Of course, there are many other places that people have suggested them, and I'm also one of those people that has suggested them in other places. But I think Italy, to me, seems to be the most convincing. And I thought this, when I put this project together, I thought this would be the place to look for it, and it's not convincing at all.
I just had one more sort of question
Sure.
at that area. I mean, so I recently did a collection of events and then just plotted a histogram of what depths those events occur in. So sort of deep earthquakes. And there's almost no earthquakes between 250 and 350 kilometers. There's just a gap there. I mean, how much of that seismic gap might be playing into what looks like a gap or a tear that's being interpreted from the seismicity there next to WEDAR.
Yeah, very, very good question. I think that's part of it, but there also seems to be, there's a few small events in there from our new relocation. So they're not completely absent, but there's certainly globally, there's, that's been known for a very long time, but there's not that many events in that depth range. And then this is one place where it seems to be prominent that there aren't that many, but it doesn't seem to be very clear to me. I think it, doesn't seem to be a tear, which I thought there really was.
It's a really, really great talk. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike.
I think Fan Chi has some questions.
Hey, Megan, great talks.
Thank you.
So I have a couple questions, but first, I wasn't sure I understand, like you mentioned like the place where you see high topography is actually where it's not the same location where you see the fastest uplift.
That's correct.
It's just kind of counterintuitive, isn't that? Like you expect where you have more uplift will be the high topography. So I'm not sure
Exactly.
like what's the explanation? Maybe you mentioned it, but it's still unclear to me how that actually works.
So I think I didn't articulate. So you got that part right, but I think I didn't articulate it well enough with so the high topography. Let me go back actually a couple slides. Yeah, so here's the uplift rate. So the highest at the end, and then the smooth topography, most of the uplift rates, for example, faster uplift rates are here, but the high topography is here. And then if we look at where this inferred structure is, this is where this fast velocities are, and maybe thicker crust, for example. So this is the isostasy would be the explanation for why you have this high topography here. So you have this thickened, faster velocity material, which are supporting the roots of these high mountains. But you would expect that where you have you're in an orogenic area, you would have high uplift at the regions where there's high topography, but that's not the case. So it is counterintuitive, and so that was kind of the striking feature. But you're right, I didn't explain the thickened or high velocity material is where the high topography is. I hope that explained that better.
So the ongoing uplift in the just more last like 100,000 years, is that like why? I guess my question is why it's on the northeast and southwest edge. Is that just due to collision, or is it due to if it's due to collision, isn't that it should uplift the entire island?
Yeah, so I guess since there's variable structure along the island of Timor, it's being uplifted in different ways, and it's not entirely clear why it's uplifting at either end, because it doesn't seem to be bowed, right? So, but that's what the uplift rates look like. And previous results had suggested that they were tilting up, like the North Shore was tilting upward, which would also make sense if there was a slab tear, is that you're ripping off from the northern boundary, and that's tipping up. So earlier results suggested that, but now it looks like it's actually just the ends, not just the northern side.
I see. Well, another quick question. That's just in general, like in the past, like SKS fast direction, we always use that to infer like flow direction. I don't know, like here you are basically just mostly kind of emphasize where the change happens, but I guess, do you have like some sort of assumption like how the mantle actually is flow? Are you seeing the subduction direct? I guess like the anisotropy related to the subduction, or is it related to the mantle wedge area?
So it looks like most of it is due to the subduction zone, not from the mantle wedge. I didn't show that we have local splitting results as well, and they generally follow the same pattern, but there's a little bit more variation there. And then we're also looking at receiver functions and looking at what the anisotropy is within the crust and the mantle wedge too, which are even more complicated as well. So, but for the SKS, we're just inferring that this is from the subducted slab flow, induced flow, not from the mantle wedge.
And don't you expect it should be kind of in the same direction as the subduction direction instead of like perpendicular to it?
Yeah, so that's also a good question. So most of the splits are, other than that one area where in north-south, most of them are east-west, which is consistent with toroidal flow. And so you'd have this, as a slab is rolling backwards, for example, then you would get this toroidal flow around the front. And so that's the simplest explanation. None of these are completely satisfying to me, but to be honest, but yeah, that's the simplest way to explain it. Yeah.
Sure. All right, thanks.
You're welcome.
We have time for another question or two if anyone has one. I actually have a question. I'm wondering, and this may not be a very intelligent question, I'm not sure, but if there were a tear and you had sort of mantle flow into that, would that manifest itself in terms of higher heat flow? Would it manifest itself in terms of maybe a helium isotope anomaly in ocean chemistry, or is it too deep to, you know?
Yeah, it's probably too deep because you know, it's asthenospheric scale depth. So I plotted them at 200 kilometers depth would be kind of the peak that you would assume this this flow may be happening. So below the lithosphere. Yeah, I wouldn't assume that you would see any heat flow anomaly at that depth, but others may have. But it seems the other part of this kind of puzzle is that you have to have a few million years of flow to be able to see it in the SKS. So, you know, that tear would have to have been open for a few million years to be able to accumulate the strain to be able to align the LPO in that. And so that's another piece of the puzzle that also isn't quite, you know, it's just on the edge of being able to resolve that. Do we have enough time to actually a flow through a proposed tear to be able to actually see it? And so, yeah, but I think, yeah, mostly the chemistry of the volcanoes, I think, is one of the most convincing pieces of evidence.
Well, perhaps if there are more questions, remind you that we'll kind of leave the Zoom session open. It's so difficult and awkward to do proper applause and so forth over Zoom, but Megan, thank you so much. I didn't mention to people that you know, she's doing this talk under lockdown circumstances, the degree to which we actually haven't quite even experienced here in the US. So it's an awkward, difficult thing, and we really appreciate your time today and such a great talk. Understand that if we could properly applause you, we would, but thank you very much. And again, I'll leave the Zoom session open if anyone wants to hang around and chat a bit.
Thank you very much. Thank you.